Evan Thomas is well known as an author and journalist. He grew up in a literary household. His father was a celebrated book editor who, among many titles, edited Profiles in Courage. And in fact, not only edited that book, which of course won the Pulitzer Prize, but actually convinced John F. Kennedy to write. The Evan Thomas with us today started his career as a newspaperman in Hackensack, New Jersey. He went on to Time, where he covered legal affairs at the Supreme Court and Congress for 9 years, and to Newsweek, of which he served as Washington bureau chief beginning in 1986. He also served for 22 years, or has served for 22 years as AME and as editor-at-large. And you probably recognize him because he is a frequent guest on Sunday morning news talk shows. Or you may recognize him because he's no stranger to Charlottesville, having graduated from UVA Law School in 1977. He's the author of 11 books, the subjects ranging from the American presidency to Robert F. Kennedy, from John Paul Jones to the Cold War, not least of which is his most recent, published last September by Bill Brown and Company, Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World. The Washington Post called the book, quote, a thoroughly researched, tightly organized, and briskly written biography, end quote, that proves Mr. Thomas is, quote, especially skilled at bringing characters of the era to life. Janet Maslin of the New York Times called it a bustling anecdotal book with a high-concept premise that approaches the ever more changeable Eisenhower legacy with new and intriguing questions. Please welcome Evan Thomas.
Delighted to be back in Charlottesville. I have a fond place in my heart for Charlottesville because I met my wife, Osie, in civil procedure class at UVA Law School 38 years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is Jeff.
Hi, I'm sorry, the buses never came with
I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came about to write this book, and I hope that sheds some light on my subject. I was a journalist for many years, and I worked for Newsweek. And in the Iraq War in 2003, I was a hawk, like a lot of journalists. Many of whom have forgotten that they were hawks today, but I have to admit it. Now, this made me think about the nature of war and what it is that makes war attractive, particularly to men. I think women are less susceptible to this lure. And by my own hawkishness, made me interested. Why do men want to get us into war? So I wrote a book about Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War, because Teddy Roosevelt was just crazy to go to war himself. And until he rode up San Juan Hill on a horse and got shot at, he just had this burning desire that could be satisfied no other way. And that book, called The War Lovers, helped me sort of think through this. Well, that led me to wonder about this figure, arguably one of the great war heroes of all time, who led the invasion of Europe in 1944, Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, who hated war. Quite the opposite from Teddy Roosevelt. He was the warrior who wanted to keep the peace. So I started thinking about him. And I started thinking about him because if you're going to write a presidential biography, you need a frame. You need some way to look at it. You can't just, if you just walk into a presidential library and say, I'm going to write a biography of this guy, forget it. There are a million documents there, you're lost. You need some way to think about it. And so my way into Ike was wondering, how could this great warrior develop such a thorough hatred of war and be so determined to keep us out of war as President of the United States, which he did. Once he got us out of Korea, which took him about 3 months, Eisenhower never committed combat troops. Again, no other modern president can say that. So I started fishing around on this, and I was talking to a journalist named John Newhouse, who we were talking about the Dulles brothers, and the conversation turned to Andrew Goodpaster. Andrew Goodpaster had been Ike's closest aide, really, called the staff secretary, but really the aide who did the hairiest stuff, nuclear stuff, secret stuff, CIA stuff. And Goodpaster had told my friend before he died that in all that time, Eisenhower had never told him whether he would use nuclear weapons and under what circumstances. And I started thinking about that. You know, God, talk about the loneliness of command. To have that be the central issue for this first president, really, of the nuclear age, the first president who really had the power to end the world, certainly to end the Northern Hemisphere, threatened by the Soviet Union, and to never tell anybody under what circumstances he would use nuclear weapons is a strange kind of burden that I think most of us can barely imagine. So I started reading into this and thinking about this, and I read a book by George Bundy about nuclear policy, and Bundy was sort of puzzled by Eisenhower, but he had a very interesting story about Jack Kennedy that was a kind of a light bulb for me. In 1961, Jack Kennedy came in, and there was a crisis in Berlin, and young President Kennedy suddenly had to ask himself, oh my God, how do you know when to go nuclear? When to actually use these terrible weapons? So they brought in Dean Acheson, who had been Secretary of State under Harry Truman. And I think the idea of Acheson was to give the young president a dose of stiff blood and make him stand up to the communists. Well, Kennedy said to Acheson, how do you know when to go nuclear? And Acheson said, well, Mr. President, if I were you, I'd think about that for a long time, and I would tell no one. Tell no one. And I thought, of course, you really can't tell it. You can't have an effective nuclear deterrence. It's not really an effective threat anymore if you do tell anybody. There are no secrets in Washington. I mean, even if you tell your wife, sooner or later, the word's going to get out. And so Eisenhower really didn't tell anyone. Now, I kept on reading, and there was a wonderful PhD thesis by a guy named Campbell Craig, who had had this insight that Eisenhower had read Clausewitz on War. Now, you know there's a famous expression from Clausewitz on War that war is just politics by another means. It's just an extension of politics by another means. Craig figured out that Eisenhower took a different meaning from Clausewitz. That war is a mutating monster, and it can get out of control easily. And that politicians and statesmen who think they can control war are kidding themselves. This idea that you can have limited wars, half a war, and gradual escalation, and flexible response, all these fads that academics were talking about, Henry Kissinger and people like that were talking about, is an illusion. And Eisenhower based his presidency on this idea that he wasn't going to get us into any war, because he realized that small wars have a way of getting out of control and getting us into big war. And that was the central. Now, this doesn't mean be an isolationist. It didn't mean come home and forget about it. 1953, you look at a map, and it's turning red. Eastern Europe and Asia have recently become communist. Now, a lot of the Soviet threat and the communist threat, as we know now, exaggerated. But at the time, it sure looked threatening. So Eisenhower had to come up with a strategy that would avoid small wars and try to avoid the big war. Essentially, he bluffed. He bluffed with nuclear weapons. And that's what my book is about. Now, it's not so simple. People have known for a long time that we were running this bluff. Dulles announced it in 1954 when he talked about massive retaliation, basically saying the communists even look at us wrong. We reserve the right to choose with times and places of our choosing, with means of our own choosing. Means of our own choosing meant nuclear weapons against Soviet aggression. But how Ike actually did that was endlessly fascinating to me, because he was very much behind the scenes. He ruled or ran the government with what a Princeton professor, Fred Greenstein, called the hidden hand. He did not advertise what he was doing. It was very subtle and deft. He used Dulles, for instance, to kind of pound the Soviets and threaten and talk about massive retaliation. Interestingly, another professor named Immerman, a Temple guy, found in Dulles' speech file that the key paragraph about massive retaliation wasn't written by Dulles, it was written by Eisenhower. But Eisenhower didn't want to take the credit for it. He wanted to let Dulles take the credit for it. Let Dulles be the bad cop so Eisenhower could be the good cop. I realized I was dealing with a very complicated person. Fortunately, there were some interesting documents on this. Eisenhower's doctor, a guy named Howard Snyder, kept a daily diary about Eisenhower's mood. Eisenhower was himself a Victorian gentleman who was damned if he was going to tell anybody his mood. Now, he showed his mood, but he certainly was not the kind of blabby, self-revealing. Eisenhower had no blog. There was no, he was not a tell-all guy at all. But his doctor, observing him, was able to see his mood, and he wrote it down every single day. And Ike was, surprise, surprise, a human being. There's one entry I found that he had thrown his golf club at his doctor. He had exploded on the golf course, trying to hit a with a sand wedge. And the doctor gave him some false praise to try to make him feel better, and Ike threw his sand wedge at him. So he had a temper, but he hid that temper. He controlled it. His aides knew about it. Ike used to quote his mother, who was a fundamentalist Christian, and his mother would say, quote scripture to young Eisenhower, that he who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh the city. And Eisenhower said, well, my mother, she taught me how to control my temper. And one of his aides said, I thought what a poor job she had done. Because he did have a temper, but he controlled it publicly. And that was key to him. He was a very, in some ways, a contradictory figure. He had this sunny, warm smile that probably many of you remember, but he also could be pretty icy cold. I spent a lot of time with his son, his only son, John, who at the age of 88 was still trying to figure out Dad. Imagine being Dwight Eisenhower's son. The first sentence of John Eisenhower's memoir is, I think I was born standing at attention. And he was, fortunately for me, willing to share his own thoughts about his father. We were talking about the balance between the sunny, warm, genial Ike and the cold, calculating Ike, cold-blooded Ike. And I said 50-50, and John Eisenhower, the son, said, make that 75% cold-blooded. That's his own son. So he was a cold-blooded guy, but he had a quality that to me was very important. And it's what I call the confidence to be humble. He had a huge ego. You can't be Supreme Allied Commander without having a big ego. And he was vain. Remember that Eisenhower jacket? He designed that himself. Now, he didn't wear medals because he didn't want to show off, and compare that with a lot of generals today. But he knew he looked pretty good in the uniform. And he had a big ego, but he controlled it, and he was so confident that he was able to be humble when it mattered. And I think this is a great quality. He had this appreciation, he understood this calculus, that people who are arrogant are usually actually pretty insecure and fearful. And people who are really confident can be humble. I wish I could follow this own rule myself, along with another quality he had of being patient. He was endlessly patient. But these were incredibly important human qualities, and for all his flaws, they carried him a long way. They allowed him to keep secrets. They allowed him not to show off. They allowed him to share credit. They allowed him to work across the aisle to deal with Democrats as well as Republicans, to praise LBJ. He might have made fun of him behind his back, but when LBJ was with him, he would talk about how he'd be a great president. And he was able to get a lot done because he was able to sublimate and swallow his own ego here, even to the extent sometimes of playing dumb. There's a famous press conference in 1955 when Eisenhower's aides were warning him, be careful, Mr. President, you're going to be asked these questions about Red China. And Eisenhower said, oh, don't worry, I'll just confuse them. And he did. Spoke gibberish. His memos were clear as a bell. But often in press conferences, you couldn't figure out what the hell he was talking about. That was at least partly calculated. And it's a great quality, and it's one I'm going to just end on this note. It's one I wish we had more of today. That our own politicians who seem to be, there are many things that I like about President Obama, but he can seem a little cocky and a little kind of peevish at times, and a little bit sort of put upon, like he's doing us a favor to be president. I don't think that's the most endearing quality, and I think Eisenhower understood that and had this kind of humility that was not just an admirable human quality, but made him effective. Not always, but often, and effective on the big thing. He kept us out of war all those years.